Stage 15, 181 kilometers, so about 110 miles. You have the category 2, pretty much right out of the chute, with about 500 meters of gain. And then towards the end, there's a category 1 with about 1,000 meters of gain, so over 3,000 feet, and then a long downhill. So the catch will be any breakaway riders or any riders from the GC, if they go over that mountaintop, that last crest, and then try to get to the finish line, they're going to need a good buffer because the downhill is so long. There's plenty of time for other riders to catch up. And really, even after the descent, there's a good 10-kilometer or so flatter stage to the finish. So then even if you get down to the bottom with a 20 or 30-second buffer, that's probably not enough unless you are just a super strong solo rider that can almost ride an individual time trial just with pure power. And it looks like it's windy near the end of the stage, so any solo rider or small group is going to be dealing with wind. Pretty much out of the chute, the same old players. DeGant gets out there on the front, Sagan and those guys, Kamajan, a lot of the same players that we've heard of, teams still trying to get a win, trying to help their team set up something. They're getting out there on the front of the peloton. The French guy, Demar, he had an issue, so he's already off the back. So poor guy, because he's already dropped, if he can't catch up to the peloton, he's going to have to basically ride the whole stage as a solo ride. Well, at one point, he was a few minutes off the back. It was very hilly early in the stage. So lots of pain for people that are hurting, people that weren't looking forward to hills right out of the chute after this far into the tour. You had the front core of the peloton with your GC type riders. And then other than the riders trying to get away into the breakaway, you had basically a second peloton that was a couple minutes back, and then somebody like Demar who was even behind them. Demar got a teammate to go back and help pace him. And as things settled down, as the stage progressed, Demar caught up, and actually the whole peloton came back together. So that second peloton, or that second core that was a few minutes back, they eventually closed ranks, and that became one group again. And Demar also was able to catch up. What kind of sucks, though, is the teammate who went back to help Demar, he then dropped off the back for a while. And because the priority is Demar, no one's really going to help them as a domestique. They're on their own just to catch up. So there's where it's kind of sucky. You do your duty, and then you got to kind of take it. Barguil tried to get out in front. He tried to go solo. They pretty much brought him back. There were immediate chases. Every time the breakaway tried to form, other riders would immediately chase. And then meanwhile, you had Sky and the GC peloton portion, basically staying right there, helping to control the tempo. So they were essentially monitoring who's going to go into the breakaway, sort of leaving the door open for riders to go into the breakaway, but then not allowing certain riders or too many, or just keeping that tempo high enough to sort of just keep things under control. The breakaway would form. They would get out in front, like at one point, Adam Yates was out there, Barguil was out there, but then there was still a chase. So the peloton pace was pretty high. And as they caught up to Yates and Barguil, then another breakaway would form. Finally, say around 140, 150 kilometers to go, finally enough of the teams were able to get somebody into the breakaway. They were satisfied. That then, by Sky and the other GC contenders observing it, they were satisfied. And so then they pretty much shut things down. So from that point, this breakaway was allowed to form up and then build up a nice gap. De Gent, in the past, had spoken about that art or what is required to get in a breakaway and how to sort of break away from the peloton. And what he basically noted is you have to be mentally and physically strong enough once you commit to trying to get into a breakaway. You just have to ride at a really hard pace, balls out, for 5 minutes. And then you hope that within that 5, 6 minutes, that's enough where the peloton lets you get away. If the peloton chases, or if other riders close the gap, and that brings a reaction from the peloton, then you may need to ride hard for 10 or 15 or even 15 plus minutes. And usually within 15 or 20 minutes of a breakaway riding in a committed fashion at a very hard pace, that is usually enough to finally break free. So you just have to mentally know you can test, and depending on your strength, you're hoping within 5 to 7 minutes that's enough to get a gap, but you have to be willing to be able to ride hard for 15 to 20 minutes. There's the whole vibe there at the front of the peloton, or the mindset, where you have to sort of read the mood of the peloton and read the tempo or the pace of the peloton. So then there's that judgment call. Yeah, stay near the front of the peloton, and then when you see the breakaway forming and you think that it's going to work, then you have to make the decision, do you go? Because if you go too soon and you get out in front of the peloton but they chase, you may have expended too much energy, and that's it. You don't get a second or third chance, or you're just too tired to try again in the rest of that stage. If you hesitate when the true breakaway is forming and then the peloton decides to let that group go, now if you decide to go, instead of just jumping out and pursuing or chasing that breakaway as it's forming, where you only have to ride hard and cross a gap of 30 meters, 80 meters, 100 meters, now if you want to get across, you got to jump across a 200, 300, 400 meter gap. And if there's any kind of wind, again, though, you may just use up too much energy. And then I think this is where the savviness comes in, to know the terrain, where you may know, okay, at this point, the terrain suits where I can cross a 500 meter gap to the breakaway. Or no, based on the terrain and the wind or the crosswinds, I have only maybe a 10 or 20% chance of making it, so I'm going to wait, or that's it. The thing is, you can only wait or say that's it so many times, since the stage really only, or the tour only has so many stages like this where there are opportunities for breakaways. So really, I think it's less the minutia of the course and more just watching what's going on, and then being able to think on your bike or on your feet, and then know when to just make that move, or just to have the strength to know you can do a couple kicks and trust that maybe the second or third time it goes, you're able to get into that breakaway and then be able to stay in the breakaway. As they got nearer to the latter portion of the race, the stage, and as they approached that Category 1 climb, there were some climbers in that breakaway. So now the decision making, or the threat, is the climbers want to use their advantage and attack on the mountain and get over the top of the mountain with enough of a buffer to survive to the finish. The problem is, on the descent and or on the flatter lead in to the finish, they may not be strong enough as climbers and as lighter riders to be able to stay ahead. The flip side is, the climbers can drop the non-climbers to get that noted buffer. So the non-climbers have to make the decision, do they attack the climbers and try to get a buffer going up the early parts or the middle part of that last Category 1 climb, so that even if the climbers catch up to them, at the very least they'll all go over the top together, and now the non-climbers, being stronger or better on the flats or more of a classic type rider, they can drop those climbers on the descent and or drop them on the lead into the finish. So sure enough, some of the non-climbers went ahead and tried to attack going uphill. That was, well, at one point, Common John was out in front. And it's interesting note, or to give credit to the Team Direct Energy. Common John is in Team Direct Energy. Pretty much every single stage of the tour this year, they have been doing something aggressive. They've gotten riders into the breakaway. They've pretty much participated in every breakaway. They've gone out on solo attacks. So Direct Energy, not being one of the big budget teams like a Sky, they are doing their part to shake up the race and or to try to get some wins. Common John rode solo out in front of the breakaway, and he was a good 6 to 7 minutes in front of the core peloton, and he only got about a minute ahead of the rest of the breakaway. So his team director finally talked to him and let him know the realistic probability that he's not going to survive. So he might as well hold up and save his energy and let the breakaway catch up to him. The peloton was definitely in more of a saving the legs mode. They let the breakaway get 10 minutes and then even 11, 12, 13 minutes ahead. They were not pushing it. They were just riding a steady tempo. Another direct energy rider, Grelier, he goes on a solo attack. This is about 70 kilometers from the finish. The breakaway is about 200 meters back. Another rider, Bernard, catches up to Grelier, so there's the two of them. And they get the advantage up over the rest of the breakaway to about a minute and then to about a minute 30. So this is about 50, 55 kilometers to go to the finish, and they're on the climb. So they're beginning that last Category 1 climb. The peloton is a good 12 minutes back. And by this point, Demar had caught up, and pretty much all the little groups that had fallen off the back in the early hilly part of the stage, and where the pace was really high with all the little attacks and the jockeying to get into the breakaway, they all had merged back. So what's kind of funny, here's a little nugget for you. The commentator mentioned France's reliance on nuclear power, where they said that even though you see these windmills, they only provide about 1 or 2% of the energy or the power to France. So then they mentioned that one of the power plants that you could see in the background near Grenoble from a recent stage, where the French are thinking about closing down that plant. So then they threw in the little aside, oh, hey, these nuclear power plants are great until something goes wrong. And oh yeah, remember that other city that ended in Noble, kind of making a little aside to, of course, Chernobyl. But here's the thing. So yeah, the mainstream story is the Chernobyl disaster was a reactor explosion or a reactor detonation. But what they missed is that was actually a mini nuke. So that was sabotage. So a mini nuke was set off, and then it was just smoothed over or covered over by saying that it was the actual reactor exploding. And the thing to think about is, just from a common sense, a normal civilian reactor like that does not detonate to have the ability to blow the roof off of that reactor building. Where that reactor building was built like a sarcophagus or like a tomb, or like one of those sub-pens there in France from World War II that the Germans built, where it's all reinforced concrete that's very thick. And so no little, quote, meltdown or China syndrome would blow, 6 feet, 10 feet of concrete that's reinforced with rebar, where it literally blows it up and blows these chunks that weigh thousands of pounds 50, 80, 100 feet away from the building. So anyway, we can go with the mainstream thing. Hey, that's cool. It's dummy load. But the reality is that was a mini nuke, and let's call it sabotage. There's a little nugget for you. Dan Martin, he talked about his bad luck where he got the puncture yesterday, or on stage 14 Saturday, since this is Sunday, stage 15. He basically said it's kind of tough for him because he's too close in GC for the peloton to let him go in a breakaway. And then on the flip side, the breakaway doesn't want him because, one, he's strong enough to crush all but maybe the very best. And then two, it would draw too much attention of the peloton where they would never let the breakaway escape. So that's your paradox. If you're one of these guys in GC that's in 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th place, what do you do other than just outright kicking Froome and Thomas and Dumoulin's ass and Bardet's ass and those guys that are only a minute or two down on the yellow jersey? It's very difficult to do these solo attacks and get away with it for the very reasons that were just noted. Now, here's the funny thing. It's kind of foreshadowing a little bit because two things basically happen. Here you've got that Bernard and Grelier up ahead in the breakaway. And yet here comes one of the climbers. Rafa Micah starts to close the gap. He jumps out from the little breakaway group. He attacks with about 6 or 7 kilometers to go to the top of the climb. And he's within basically 30 seconds. Well, not much later than that, where remember the peloton is 11, 12, 13 minutes back. When they get to the base of this climb and in the first kilometer or so, Dan Martin goes for it. He tries. He goes for the attack. And the peloton and Sky pretty much let him go because they have to figure, even if Dan Martin rides the greatest climb of his ability, he's not going to get more than a minute and a half or 2 minutes or maybe max 2:15, 2:30 ahead of Sky. And they can technically afford to give that up because he's 6-7 minutes behind in the GC. Plus, again, Dan Martin has to make that descent and then the run in on the flats. So I'm sure they kind of know, okay, even if Dan Martin at the top of this climb is 2+ minutes ahead of us, if we just kick it up a little bit, kick up the pace between going over the top at a quicker pace and then descending and then riding hard on the flats, we can bring that back to a minute, minute and a half max, which is cool for Dan Martin. But at the same token, how much energy would Dan Martin be expending to gain at best maybe a minute 30? So Micah catches up to Grelier, then he catches up to Bernard 10, 15 seconds later. Bernard hangs with him for a little while, but with about 4.5, 5Ks to go, Micah drops him. Now, in the meantime, the other guys in the breakaway, they are not falling back that far. They're not that far behind Micah. At one point, they put up the stat, Common John, he rode at the same kilometer per hour pace as Micah. So here's kind of the catch. It basically shows that some of these second tier and third tier riders, how strong they are. So, here a Micah, here a Common John, here a Grelier. They are not strong enough to be even in the top 10, as we know. They are not strong enough to beat a Froome. But they are strong enough where they're just second tier. So with the peloton not really pushing it hard, 10, 11, 12 minutes behind them, these other non-climbers, these classics riders or these time trialists or these all-arounders, just guys who can ride in the flats or they can be a good domestique, on a good day when they're feeling pretty good, they're not going to crack. This is a Category 1 climb, and these guys are riding really well. They're not being caught by the peloton. The gap is still up at 11, 12 minutes, and they're not letting a climber like Micah get away. But that also is maybe a testament that Micah was also not as strong as he wished he could be in the past or has been in the past, where then Micah would have dropped these guys. And going over the top of this mountain, he could have a 2 or 3 minute gap. Little tidbits. They threw out one of the fines. Here's an idea of how ticky-tacky the controllers of the race can be. One rider pushed another rider to kind of help them out. These are guys that are way back. They're not pushing for GC. They're not close to the yellow. They're on different teams though. They were fined 200 Swiss francs and they were given a 10-second penalty. Just pushing another rider where you feel bad for them, or maybe they were a former teammate, and here you're already minutes and minutes back, or even an hour back, just giving a little push 2 or 3 times, or even just one push, and the controllers of the race see you, and there you go, 200 Swiss franc fine and a 10-second penalty. The thing for Micah, or the thing to think about this Category 1 climb, maybe it's not really steep enough. There's some steeper sections in it, but a lot of it, it's only about a 6 or 7% grade. Micah is building up a lead. He is getting 45 seconds, 50 seconds a minute, but he's not really getting it beyond that. And then really, as the other riders begin to chase him, they're only 25, 30, 35 seconds back. Let's say it's helping everybody that this category 1 is not a really hard, steep climb. But at the same token, if it was too hard and steep, maybe the breakaway doesn't get away. So once again, from the race organizers, they got to mix it up. They got to throw in a variety of terrain. And if they make these hills or these mountains too steep and have too many of them, it's going to crack everybody. And so then you're just going to have maybe 100 riders left when they come into Paris, and no chance for people to make very many moves. And it's not a very exciting race overall. At the top, he had about a 30-second gap on Mollema and this guy Court-Nielsen. But Mollema is more of a climber. Court-Nielsen, more of like a classic time trialist, just an all-arounder. Dan Martin, when he goes over the top, he has about a minute on the rest of the GC group. So if he can maintain, he's got himself a minute that he can gain back from his puncture yesterday. Here's kind of that thing, though, where maybe the climb just wasn't strong enough, or again, guys can ride really well when they're right there at the second tier. Philippe Gilbert was right there with Froome and Sky and Dumoulin and that core of the GC. So here you have non-climbers, more all-arounders or classic riders that were hanging. 22 kilometers to go. Micah has a 16 second gap. So they're on the descent and they're going down to the flat. Probably not enough. Here's the thing that sucks. Realism. Sorry, Dan Martin. God damn it. It pisses me off because I'm rooting for Dan Martin. And bravo to the Irishman. Bravo to all these riders. About 13 kilometers to go to the finish. Dan Martin caught by that core peloton. He pretty much stopped pushing it a kilometer or two earlier than that, where it became a realization he's not going to make it to the finish, and if he keeps fighting, he's going to expend too much energy. So why blow himself up right before the rest day when he's got to make bigger moves in the next few days? But it also just shows you how freaking hard it is to get away. Because here Dan Martin tried it. He was bold. He attacked at the base of a Category 1 climb. And he got himself a 50-second minute buffer. And by the bottom of the descent, they had already caught him. And they still had the flat portion to go into the finish. So even if he still had a 30 or 40-second buffer a mile or two down the road, they still would have caught him before the finish. Or if they let him go because they didn't want to ride hard, at best he would have only gained 15 seconds. So all that work to ride solo and go for it, and you get 15 seconds. Micah also was caught. So again, Micah, even a weaker rider in this tour at least than Dan Martin, he tried it, he got himself a gap, and they caught him. It just really shows, and this is a frustrating thing for me, I love the aggressive riding. It definitely makes for a better chase. It makes for a better stage, but it really shows how hard it is once these things play out, once the narrative is set, to do anything to really move yourself up. There's 8 guys that caught Micah. It's Valgren, Calmenjon, Micah, Scoyens, Mollema, Court-Nielsen, Izagirre, and this Pozzovivo. So you got a mix of more climbers like Micah and Mollema. Then you got more power sprinter types like Court-Nielsen. And then you got more kind of, let's say, support riders or all-arounders and maybe like an Izagirre. Once again, train in the wind. You must train in the wind because in this flat coming into the finish, there were winds. Potentially, if this still was 30 miles to go to the finish, this would be where the peloton once again could have riders set a hard pace and attack, and once again it would cause a split in the peloton and time could be lost. But this last little flat portion is only 6, 8, 10 miles, so not really enough, and with everybody exhausted and with everybody just wanting to get into the frickin' rest day to regroup and mentally prepare for the Pyrenees, not really anybody is going to make that choice. But the potential was and is there for a longer lead-in to have the wind jack you up. So out of these 8 riders, You get the stronger riders broke away. If anybody wants to cycle, even as an amateur, you better train in the wind. You got to get out there where you're having 20, 25-mile-an-hour wind. And again, you just got to prove that mentally and physically you can sustain 25 plus miles per hour for like 20 to 30 miles in sustained crosswinds and headwinds. The attacks began with about 6 to 7 kilometers to go. So you just have the 3 now out of that 8. You've got Izagirre, Court-Nielsen, and Mollema. The others couldn't hang. Kamajan tried. Few other riders tried, but they couldn't cross that gap. And you could see them get dejected. They'd give it a kick. They would burst out from the other 5. They would get 15, 20 feet. And then a few seconds later, you just see them dejectedly come back into that little second group of 5. Meanwhile, Izagirre, Court-Nielsen, and Mollema are powering away. So again, it boils down to that: how much power can you generate after you've already ridden 80 miles, 70, 80, 90 miles, and then in the winds on rolling or flat terrain? And the other catch is, because some of these guys don't want to work together, either because they've got a teammate or a team that they're not a rival against out in that breakaway, so they don't want to help anybody else get up there to them, or they don't want to help somebody bridge that gap only to have that person that they helped drop them and then maybe get first or second in the stage, where they come in 4th or 5th or 6th, 8 or 10 seconds back. So they might as well all just come in 20 seconds back together. The 3 guys in the front, Court-Nielsen, Izagirre, and Mollema, are playing cat and mouse. They're sizing each other up. Izagirre goes for it with like 1.5, 1.2 kilometers to go. And he gets ahead of Mollema and Court-Nielsen, but they drag him back. And then they proceed from like a kilometer, 900 meters, 800 meters, 700 meters. They're cat and mousing. They're doing guesswork. Who should go? Who should go? Problem is Court-Nielsen has more power. So if Izagirre and Mollema are not strong enough, or they wait too long, Court-Nielsen's going to win. Sure enough, too much cat and mouse, too much energy expended. They gave it a go. Court-Nielsen outsprints them. He gets the win. So look at Team Astana. Team Astana, what's going on? Fuglsang is doing okay, but Fuglsang is like, 10th, 11th, 12th place. But look at yesterday, here, Frele, Team Astana wins. And now today, Court-Nielsen, Team Astana wins. So just like that, Team Astana gets their 2-stage wins back-to-back, feeling good. The peloton comes in 9, 10, 11 minutes later. Even though there were the crosswinds, they were in no mood to make it serious. It formed up, and it ended up being just sort of a casual, boring, let's cruise in and just plan for the future, which is cool. All right, take it easy, guys.